Medium Marka Whippet's foreigner, the Triton Chaser. According to the engineer William Triton, credited as one of the inventors of the tank, he was asked to produce a lighter tank when he visited Thesum on the 20th of September 1916. This was only 5 days since tanks had been launched onto the battlefield for the very first time. Triton does not say who requested this, but the implication must be that it was Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force BF, either directly or through his staff. No matter who was responsible, it was either a remarkably person or a very lucky guess. It is valid to ask whether the idea of a faster, lighter machine was considered as an alternative to the slower, heavier tanks, or as an adjunct to them, which we have always assumed. But the fact that Triton's design did not have the trench-crossing ability of the heavy tanks, and that improved versions of the heavy tank were developed, must support the adjunct theory in retrospect. It is interesting to consider what fellow engineer Walter Wilson, another crucial contributor to the early tank, knew of all this. Given his close association with Triton, and the fact that he was later appointed Joint Director of Design for the Mechanical Warfare Department, it seems unlikely that he was entirely ignorant of developments. In a paper that appears to be dated towards the end of 1916, he speculates on future developments, including that of a light tank that, he says, would need only low-sling tracks and perhaps a turret. All of this suggests that he knew full well that Triton was working on a lighter model, yet he says nothing at all about the driving system or transmission, which is odd, bearing in mind that these were his areas of expertise. Perhaps he knew what Triton was planning but elected to keep his opinions to himself. However, he also seemed to be aware of what Harry Ricardo, another engineer, was doing in terms of designing a more powerful engine for the heavy tanks, and implies, although he does not actually say so, that this engine would also be very effective on a lighter type of tank. The story of the invention of the tank published by William Foster and co-shortly after World War I, the tank its birth and development, while largely company propaganda, is remarkably specific about dates. It states, for example, that design work on Triton's light machine, later to be known as the Whippet, commenced on the 10th of November 1916, and that construction began on the 21st of December the same year. It has been said that Triton based his design on the prototype machine Little Willie C and VG-100, but there is number 5 hard evidence for this beyond the low profile of the track frames. Even so, this may explain a comment in an old tank museum publication that claims that Triton first designed a light tank in 1915. Foster's claim that the prototype was able to move itself by 3 February 1917 and embarked upon its first trial 8 days later suggests that it was effectively complete, but the date that stands out in the Whippet's history must be the 3rd of March 1917. On that day, the Ministry of Munitions staged a demonstration of experimental tanks on a testing ground at Oldbury near Birmingham, ostensibly arranged to try out a selection of experimental Trinismus systems in heavy tank hulls. The opportunity was also taken to introduce 2 experimental prototypes, the original gun carrier machine and what was now described as the Triton Chaser. The program that accompanied the event included a simple drawing of each tank and a reasonably detailed technical description, but the drawing of the Triton Chaser has always been controversial. It shows tank fitted with a small rotating turret, which, according to the description, contained a single Lewis gun. However, since every known photograph of the tank shows it with the more familiar angled superstructure, it has been claimed that the drawing was an early concept that had been changed before it was completed. Alas for such logical speculation, 2 photographs showing the machine with a turret, as in the drawing, subsequently surfaced, so there is no longer any need to speculate. Although it is described as the Triton Chaser in the program, the caption beneath the drawing tells us that it is Triton's light machinino, 2MB. The names were interchangeable, although the former was more appealing. Number 2 was simply the tank's place in the display and should not be taken to suggest that it was Triton's second design, while M gives its official designation of Experimental Machine B, a system which appears to have been applied on an inconsistent basis. To make absolutely sure that the various tank models could readily be identified, each one except for the gun-carrying machine was painted in a distinguishing color. Exactly how this was done is again not entirely clear, but such evidence as there is suggests that it took the form of a broad stripe running around the hull about midway up. For the Triton Chase, the distinguishing color was green. Since it is clear from the illustrations, there is no need to describe the outward appearance of the machine, but there are various notes in the Oldbury program that might be expanded upon. The Triton Chaser is introduced as an attempt to meet the requirements of the military authorities for a light machine capable of maintaining higher speeds than the standard type. So speed was the primary issue, suggesting perhaps a form of tracked armored car. The paragraph ends with the simple sentence its twin-engine transmission is worthy of note. It is also clear from the Oldbury program that at this time it was turreted, since under armament it states the armament consists of one Lewis gun and a gun turret. The mechanical arrangements of the Chaser are shown in the program drawing and, since they are the same as in the production Whippet, can be treated here in some detail. At the front was a pair of 7,720cc Tyler JB for 45 horsepower, 4-cylinder engines, normally running at 1,200 revolutions per minute. Manufactured by the Tyler Company of King's Cross, London, they were typical of their day, with the cylinders cast in pairs, side valve and water-cooled. Single Tyler engines were fitted to the War Department's ACY Type 3-ton cargo trucks, and, perhaps more memorably, to late production versions of the legendary Type double-deck bus of that era. Linked to a rugged 4-speed and reverse gearbox, the engine produced a hard-wearing combination highly suited to a military vehicle, or indeed a bus. The only modification required to get two of these engines along city and another in a tank was that they were handed IV inlet and outlet. Valves on the left side engine were reverse, so that the exhaust manifold would be situated on the outside in each case. Each engine had its own freewheel and cone clutch, behind which was its own gearbox, of conventional type rather than the multi-chain version originally used on the B-type bus. From the driver's point of view, the Whippet must have been something of a nightmare. In his seat, offset to the right of the turret, he was faced with a steering wheel, which also supported the ignition controls, two complete sets of gear controls and clutch pedals to go with them, and two handbrake levers. There was no differential in the usual sense. Each engine and gearbox drove its own track through a 90-worm drive onto a divided half shaft, from the outer ends of which a sprocket and chain arrangement translated drive to the rear-mounted track drive sprocket on each side. There would have been occasions when one track started to slip badly, when it would have helped to have a device that linked the two half shafts together. On the Triton Chaser, according to the Oldbury program, a simple dog clutch system was employed to serve the purpose of a differential lock. In practice, this may have placed too great a strain on the mechanism, because the production Whippets are said to have had a limited slip clutch that became effective when the difference in power output from the two engines exceeded 12 horsepower. This would have made driving on one engine extremely difficult, should the need ever arise, but not quite impossible. There are certain things about the Triton Chaser that we do not know. It seems reasonable to suppose that the radiator or radiators were located ahead of the engines, as they were in the production Whippets, but this remains unproven. It also seems likely that at this stage in its development the Whippet was started by a hand crank inserted at the front, via a hole in line with the port side engine. Although this certainly changed later. Another night change was the location of the fuel tank, which initially Triton placed at the back of his machine, down between the track frames. There can be no doubt why Triton elected to use this twin-engine system. It enabled one man to drive the tank, compared with 4 men on what was then described as a standard tank. More or less the same arrangement was planned for the proposed super tank Flying Elephant, largely one imagines in pursuit of more power, although it may also have been part of the steering arrangements. One could speculate at length upon why Triton does not appear to have consulted his colleague Walter Wilson on this, and indeed why Wilson does not appear to have been involved in the design of the Chaser at all. Triton was a businessman as well as an engineer, so it makes sense that he would look for something simple and robust that could be assembled from available components, rather than anything that might be pushing the limits of technology. He may also have felt that, while helping his country and the war effort, it would do no harm to have a design of his own that might one day have some commercial application, should it prove successful. The greatest difficulty we have is in pinpointing the date when the Triton Chaser changed shape and was rebuilt without the turret. It seems safe to assume that in its original, turreted form the tank had a crew of 2, the overworked driver and the gunner commander squeezed into his little turret. Perhaps it was simply that problems of communication between the two rendered the tank unfightable. All we can say for sure is that the tank was started when it took part in the Oldbury trials, but was probably converted not long afterwards, as the tank was seen at a similar event with a rigid, angular superstructure instead of the rotating turret, and, at a later time still, it was photographed with the fuel tank relocated to the front. This may well have been connected to the problem of center of gravity. Concerns had already been expressed about the tendency of designers to add features and, as a consequence, weight to the rear of vehicles, which had a serious adverse effect upon the center of gravity. In this form, with certain detailed differences, the tank was near enough identical to a production Whippet, although the prototype would have been constructed from an armored steel, which was easier to work. In order to achieve all-round fire, machine gun mountings were now provided in all four faces of the superstructure. The superstructure, especially at the front, was extremely complicated and better illustrated than described. However, it is notable that the left side stands proud of the driver's position, totally obscuring his view in that direction, as indeed the turret did. There was now room for three, maybe even four in the cab, which relieved the commander from being the only gunner. Since the Triton Chaser, in its final form, is virtually indistinguishable from a production Whippet, it is useful to know that there is one certain way of telling them apart. In order to reduce rolling resistance and improve speed, Triton fitted his Chaser with a full set of Skefco roller bearings on each side. Since there are 32 rollers, 16 each side, the bearing caps are pretty obvious. On production tanks, the number of rollers remained the same. Putely, the load bearing 6 on each side were fitted with roller bearings and thus the distinctive bearing caps. The ultimate fate of the Triton Chaser is known. Towards the end of view, it was seen in the background of a photograph taken at the Mechanical Warfare Supply Department testing ground at Dollis Hill in North London, where it is sporting a pair of wheels on a frame at the rear similar to those seen on Mark I tanks. In 1916, these had been fitted as a means of assisting tank over wider trenches. A report issued after the war speaks of an experimental tail skid being fitted for the same purpose, but says that both attachments tended to take the weight off the tracks and reduce grip. The report goes on to say that the wheeled alternative was better in this respect, but still not good enough. When the war was over, the Triton Chaser was included in a representative collection of tanks displayed at the original Imperial War Museum at the Crystal Palace in Upper Norwood, but was cut up for scrap when the museum transferred to a new site. Production of the Whippet Pfister & Co.'s book The Tank, Its Birth and Development claims that a total of 400 Whippets were ordered. However, only 200 were ever completed. These were the tanks built by William Foster & Co., which were numbered A202A399. It was normal practice not to begin each group of tanks from one, since it immediately gave the enemy an indication of how many tanks of each type had been produced. However, it does raise the question of why the prefixal was used. The same arrangement was employed with the gun carrier machines, which were numbered from GC 100 onwards. However, since neither of these groups of numbers clashed with any other used for tanks, this form of categorization cannot have been for that reason. It was not used on subsequent models. The medium B or medium C perhaps it was instituted, in order to make it clear that medium tanks were to be categorized in an alphabetical sequence instead of a numerical one, but that does not explain why it was dropped afterwards. All 200 of the medium Whippets were assembled at the Wellington Foundry in Lincoln, but photographs taken of the assembly lines show what appears to be a slightly haphazard arrangement. Tanks on the extreme left are little more than chassis, while those on the center line are more complete, and those on the right are even less advanced. Even so, once they were completed, the tanks were taken out onto some rough ground adjacent to the plant and put through their paces. Although most of their significant features and crew duties are described elsewhere, there are others that warrant examination. For example, the location of the engines, under armored covers at the front, was not accessible from inside the tank. Despite a large opening in the front of the cab that meant that they were visible, any maintenance carried out could be done on Libby, the crew's dismounting, going to the front, and lifting the armored cover over the engine. Any work that had to be done required at least one man to work in the open, vulnerable to any fire that might have been flying about. On a heavy tank, by contrast, the location of the engine within the body of tank meant that repair work could be carried out under the protection of the tank's armor. It would be wrong to suppose that all 200 tanks were built at around the same time. Production was steady, but it was the summer of 1918 before the majority, 166 tanks, were actually completed, and a further 3 months before the rest appeared. Thus, although there were more than enough tanks, only 2 battalions were ever completed with the new tanks. There were rumors of a further 200 tanks being ordered in the summer of 1917, but it isn't clear from whom. For a while, 400 Whippets were theoretically in order before being cancelled about 4 months later. It is not entirely clear why this order was revoked, since 2 heavy tank battalions were obliged to operate Mark IV tanks right through to the end of the war. The battalions could certainly have used the Whippets, and it is known that some of the later formations, such as the 17th, were originally earmarked for completion as Whippet battalions. None of this seems to have been understood or appreciated by General Headquarters GHQ in France. Almost immediately after the Oldbury demonstration, Sir Douglas Haig is reported to have asked for 200 of the new tanks to be delivered in France by the end of July 1917. Since the tank demonstrated at Oldbury was only a prototype and even then not in its final form, the size of this order would appear to be very optimistic to the point of being ridiculous. On the other hand, it does suggest that the staff appreciated the potential of the new tank, even if they rather underestimated the degree of work involved in producing it. Driving the Whippet among the crew of a Whippet, the only man who had a seat was the driver. Behind him was a rack of ammunition boxes, and ahead of him the controls. On the bulkhead in front of him was the visor through which he viewed the way ahead, and high up on the front wall was the autovac fuel feed system. Directly in front of him was a steering wheel, which also incorporated the ignition control. The wheel was linked to both engine throttles so that the engines could be used to steer the tank. This was described in the driver's handbook as very light, which is taken to mean responsive, but it had its limits. This method of steering would not work when both engines were running at maximum power or when both had been throttled back to minimum revolutions, because the 2 throttles needed a bit of leeway to play with. When driving at low power, below the level at which the engine governors came into effect, there was a tendency for the engines to react slightly differently to the throttle settings, causing the tank to hunt or steer indiscriminately one way or the other. On normal ground this did not seem to matter very much, but in confined spaces, or for example when the tank was climbing onto a railway wagon, it was recommended that the driver engage the friction clutch, operated by a lever on the left side of his seat, which was effective so long as the difference in engine power between the 2 engines did not exceed 12 horsepower. First, however, it was necessary to start the engines using a crank handle. When it was safe to do so, the handle could be inserted from outside the tank at the back, but in action there was a secondary crank position on the inside, which required 2 men to turn it. The cramped conditions inside the cab made this difficult. It was also necessary for a crew member to raise a small lever at one side of the cab, which engaged the starting handle with the crankshaft of each engine while it was being started. The process was reversed when it came to starting the second engine. It was possible to start one engine if the other was already running by setting both gearboxes into reverse and driving backwards on the working engine until the other one fired up. However, this worked only on reasonably soft ground where Thetrax could get a grip. The driver had to clutch pedals and to complete gearboxes, with 4 forward speeds and 1 reverse in each. The gear change levers were located on either side of his seat, slightly forward, and within easy reach of his right and left arms. The gears were changed sequentially during acceleration, note at the same time. However, since each gearbox was of the constant mesh type, it was possible to change gear while the tank was moving, something that was not possible in a heavy tank. This required the driver to double the clutch up and down each box. The clutch pedals, integral to the working of the gearboxes, were located in front of the driver's seat. These worked in the conventional way. The initial movement detached the drive from the engine and could be used to provide a free steering capability, although this only worked on very favorable ground. A more effective method of steering was to depress the clutch pedal even further in order to engage a brake, normally the clutch stop, which would also serve as a steering brake. Even driving in a straight line was far from easy, since gears had to be changed successively up and down the box. For example, assuming that driver had got the tank moving in first gear, the drill for shifting up to second was to depress one clutch pedal, move the gear lever on that seat neutral, raise and depress the clutch again, shift into second, and then raise the clutch. This would be repeated on the second gearbox and so on up throughout the range as required. Naturally, a skilled driver would slip throughout these evolutions in no time at all, and the system had the advantage, at least over the heavy tanks, that gears could be changed on the move, so that the tank could accelerate through the range from the minimum speed in first 14 of 1.75 miles per hour to 0.8 kilometers per hour to a maximum of 8 miles per hour 12.9 kilometers per hour in fourth. Speed, in the world of World War I tanks, is only ever a relative term. In order to steer, the driver had various options. One was the variable throttle control as already described, which, by turning the wheel to the left, speeded up right-hand engine and slowed down the left. This was transmitted through to the tracks, so that the tank would start to make a gentle turn to the left. This seems to have been the preferred method, since geared steering carried with it the risk of stalling one engine in the process. It has been said that the tank could spin around in its own length by having one gearbox in a forward gear and one in reverse. But this is not advised anywhere in contemporary documents and may well have been impractical. Recommended practice when making a sharp turn, or maneuvering in a tight space, was to disengage drive to one side, either be declutching or knocking the gear into neutral, and powering the tank round the other track. This would be enhanced by applying a brake to the undriven track, just as in a heavy tank. An extra brake drum with an external contracting band around. It was attached to an extension of each worm shaft. Operated frontal levers directly in front of the driver. These were used as parking brakes and were very powerful. The drive from each gearbox passed through a worm gear 16 to a driving chain pinion shaft. From this gear, the drive passed by chain-toe pinions that meshed with the track drive sprockets at the rear on either side. The Whippet in action. Whippets first arrived in small numbers at the Western Front in December 1917. To begin with, only 1 or 2 were delivered to the 3rd, 6th, and 9th Battalions, but over the next couple of months they appeared in dribs and drabs, gradually replacing the Mark IV tanks that the battalions had used at Cambrai and earlier. Even so, the units remained Mark IV battalions' fourth duration, although of course no actions were fought over this period. Whippets were issued to C Company, 9th Battalion Tank Corps in April 1918, and although often sent forward fully equipped to fight, never in fact saw any combat action with the 9th. 2 months later they were passed on to the 3rd Battalion and were replaced in the 9th by Mark V tanks, bringing C Company into line with the rest of the battalion. In fact, for a while C Company, 9th Battalion operated with the 2 Whippet-equipped companies of the 3rd Battalion, and Companies B Company was formed into Lewis gun teams at this time. The 3rd Tank Brigade, which was in the process of converting to Whippets, was in reserve at Bray-sur-Somme, northeast of Amiens. Of its constituentations, only the 3rd was fit to fight, and a dozen tanks of C Company were dispatched to deal with the enemy, which was reported to be massing southwest of Cambrai. Arriving at the village of Kohlenkamps around noon on the 26th of March 1918, they ran headlong into a couple of German battalions, which, seeing that tanks were upon them, broke and fled. The tanks pursued them eastwards almost to Serre and effectively broke up the momentum of the attack, killing and capturing a fair number of the attackers. This was regarded as an excellent early trial of the Whippets under combat conditions. Most of them had been running continuously for 16 hours before the action began, yet went straight into action and did not experience any mechanical failures at all. How the crews fared is not recorded. C Company, however, was commanded at this time by Captain T.R. Tommy Price, who about a month later would be engaged in a very similar action. At the same time, farther south, the Germans were sweeping across country and the tank training area at Bray-sur-Somme was in their path. 5 or 6 Whippets allocated for driver training were undergoing repairs, and since these could not be repaired in time they had to be wrecked by Tank Corps personnel and abandoned. These were therefore captured by the advancing Germans who, unable to repair them either, could only leave them where they stood, which is exactly how they were found when the area was recaptured some 6 months later. On the 14th of April 1918, 3rd Battalion was visited by Sir William Tritton, the designer of the Whippet. He was treated to a conference at which suggestions were put forward for improvements to the tank. These are not specified, but cannot have been very many, since the only action the Whippet had been involved in up to now had been very successful. It had not involved cavalry or trenches, so one imagines that the majority of comments were confined to the unpleasant conditions inside the tank. The designer was not in a position to do much about this at the time, but the comments may have had some bearing on his later design for the medium sea tank, which was particularly good in this respect. 5 days later, on the 19th of April, the Whippet tanks held in Brigade Reservoir formed into a temporary X Company, command of which was handed to Tommy Price. On the 22nd, X Company moved up closer to the line in a position of readiness. The enemy were attacking heavily all along the line, aiming to isolate or capture Amiens in the aftermath of their Great Spring 18 offensive, which had now been halted. It would be tempting to see the Whippets as a planned and deliberate ideal antidote to mass infantry attack, owing to their relatively greater speed and maneuverability, but the fact that they were in the area was the most likely reason why they were used. They simply happened to be in the right place at the right time. On the 24th of April 1918, X Company was in action at Kashi. The company consisted of 7 Whippet tanks, 4 from H Section, 3rd Battalion, the section commanded by Lieutenant L.B. Hoare, and 3 from E Section, commanded by Lieutenant A. Ellsbury, the whole company being under the command of Captain Price. Advancing into an area that appeared to be devoid of British defenders, the 7 tanks ran into 2 battalions of enemy troops from the 77th Reserve Division advancing to attack. The tanks swept into action with their machine guns firing and effectively carved up both battalions, chasing them off the field and claiming about 400 dead. However, 4 Whippets were hit and put out of action. To Germany, 7V tanks were recognized, NO 525 Siegfried, and later NO 500 for Schnuck. Siegfried was first on the scene, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Bitter, but his gun was giving trouble. Schnuck, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Muller, came up later, but the Whippets were also under fire from 2nd Battery, 6th Guards Field Regiment, whose 77mm guns were more than capable of destroying a Whippet if they achieved a hit. It is not clear where the fire came from that knocked out the Whippets. A number of men from X Company were wounded in the actions, but only the crew of 1 tank, 8 of 56, were reported as missing. They were 2nd Lieutenant H. Dale and his crew Lance Corporal Lincoln and Gunner Herbert. Dale appears to have been killed, although the other 2 men were probably taken prisoner. In all, X Company seems to have suffered 6 men wounded and 1 killed for Thelis of 4 tanks out of a total of 21 men and 7 tanks engaged, which is not too bad when weighed against the decimation of 2 battalions. Even if number of enemy killed was not as many as 400, there is no doubt that after the action neither battalion was fit to fight again. The following day, the 25th of April, Price was ordered to send his 3 remaining tanks to ascertain the situation. He discovered a shallow trench crowded with German infantry just west of a road in the area. His 3 tanks cruised along the road, firing into the trench with their machine guns and doing some execution. However, they also came under fire from a mass of enemy machine guns, and, although these machine guns were not firing armor-piercing rounds, they did manage to wound 2 crew members, Sergeant Hibbert and Gunner Stone, although both remained at their duty. All 3 tanks survived, although Price concluded his report by saying, "I consider that a low-flying airplane would have been able to carry out this reconnaissance more effectively." The following day Tommy Price himself was wounded. He had gone with 2nd Lieutenant Ritchie to examine one of the abandoned tanks on the Kachi battlefield when a machine gun opened up from inside the tank, wounding both officers as they approached. The infantry had informed them that the Northwest Germans were 2,000 yards away. What was left of X Company was relieved by C Company, 9th Battalion on the 28th of April. May 1918 seems to have been a relatively quiet month for the 3rd Battalion, although they were often held in readiness if a German attack began. All 3 companies had now come together again, and could muster 43 Whippet tanks between them. On the 3rd of May they received a visit from Major Gifford LeCue Martel from Tank Corps headquarters, who came to observe the installation 21 of explosive devices in tanks that were to be used for the purposes of demolition if the tank had to be abandoned or was in danger of being captured. Then on 25 May it was announced that in future C Company, 9th Battalion, attached to the 3rd Battalion, would be known as D Company, 3rd Battalion, but not for long. The commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel S.H. Sharrington, made the point firmly in any of his instructions that the tactical unit for light tanks was the company, and that tanks should not be employed in smaller numbers than this. In a later report, he pointed out that as the British extended their trench system, and because in many places the trenches were impassable to light tanks, reconnaissance routes became of the utmost importance. Towards the end of May, 3rd Battalion was involved in a major exercise with the 113th and 115th Brigades. It is instructive to note that this involved cooperation with infantry alone and that cavalry was not mentioned at all. On the 31st of May, 3 Whippets from 3rd Battalion were involved in trench crossing trials near Puigvillers, the results of which were very instructive. 2 trenches were selected. Trench A was 10 feet wide at the top by up to 8 deep, and Trench B was 10 feet 3 inches wide at the top and 7 feet 6 inches deep. They immediately discovered that the depth of the trench made no difference at all, but the width did. On Trench A the 3 tanks crossed easily in both directions, while Trench B proved impassable. Here, as a tank proceeded across and lost its grip on the near side, the back of the tank slid backwards into the trench until it came to rest, nearly vertical. The only way to get it out was to hitch another tank onto the front by rope and haul it until it was nearly level, at which point the engines could be restarted and the tank driven out with a bit of help from the towing tank. Attempts to make the crossing easier by digging ramps on the lips of the trenches made no difference. Captain May noted that when spuds were fitted to the tracks they barely had any effect at all. Who could have believed that a mere 3 inches would make so much difference? In June, the battalion was increased by the addition of 4 Mark for supply or baggage tanks, which were handed over to B Companion the 14th. On the 20th of June, it was announced that D Company, all of 26 days old, would no longer be known as such, but was to become a nucleus of the battalion driving school that was being established at the Beaumessier, near Talmas. Meanwhile, it appears that 9th Battalion had already established a new C Company, equipped with Mark V tanks. It seems, at least from June onwards, that the old C Company, the Whippet Company, simply ceased to exist. Nothing much else happened in June except that the entire battalion was stricken by influenza, but in July a series of experiments were carried out, involving cooperation with the Royal Air Force RAF. This involved 8 Squadron RAF commanded by Trafford Lee Mallory, notably a flight. Despite Tank Corps officers going up in aircraft and RAF officers traveling in tanks, it soon became clear that spotting an aircraft from a tank was difficult to know, never mind using it to obtain directions. However, 8 Squadron was established as a dedicated tank liaison squadron, so experiments continued. Meanwhile, another battalion had appeared on the Whippet scene. 6th Battalion had started to receive a few Whippets in December 1917, and more in January 1918, but training had never really got underway because of the German Spring Offensive, preceded by complications due to inclement weather and a shortage of men, as replacements were still needed after the losses of the Cambrai battle. Except for the part the battalion played in countering German offensive, which was largely a passive one, no more Whippet activity occurred until the 15th of June, when it finally handed in its old Mark for tanks and 6 days later arrived by bus at Merlemont to commence Whippet training. Conditions at Merlemont, on the Channel coast, were not good, with a lot of fine sand blowing about, while high midsummer temperatures meant that conditions inside the cab of a Whippet were worse than ever. Dealing with the sand demanded a lot of ingenuity, but nothing could be done about the heat. Training was carried out on driving and on the Hotchkiss machine gun. Since the crew of a Whippet amounted to only 2 other ranks, in addition to the officer or NCO in command, it was regarded as essential that the men were all trained to drive and fight. Although at the end of their training it was decided which men made the most promising drivers or machine gunners, and they were given. Trials at Merlemont were also carried out in tank air cooperation, but the results were no better than for 3rd Battalion. The Battle of Amiens, the 8th of August 1918, saw both Whippet battalions in action. The action began for both battalions with their moving into Amiens itself for an overnight stay on the eve of the battle. 3rd Battalion was directed to the Boulevard Pont Noyelles, where it parked up under the trees, and the men were installed in adjacent billets for the night. 6th Battalion was directed to a boulevard that led out of the city in the direction of Villers-Bretonneux, and the men were billeted in a nearby school. There were strict warnings in place concerning the risks of enemy aerial reconnaissance. Nobody was to move or congregate near the tanks, no fires were to be lit outdoors, and men were to stay in their billets until it was time to go. 3rd Battalion started to move away from Amiens just before 9 p.m., followed by 6th Battalion, which started off about midnight. 3rd Battalion was to meet up with the 3rd Cavalry Brigade, which it was supposed to be supporting, while 6th Battalion was supporting the 9th Cavalry Brigade. But it is instructive to note that no combined training had been arranged before and the extent to which either battalion could effectively assist cavalry was worked out with senior cavalry officers only shortly before they moved off. One gets the impression that nobody had any great faith in the efficacy of this arrangement. Rather than follow the experiences of these two battalions over the period of the Amiens battle, perhaps it would be more instructive to examine their general experiences with the cavalry, since, except on rare occasions, it was not repeated. The idea was that the first stage of the battle would be conducted by infantry divisions, supported by Mark V tanks, whose objective, known as the Red Line, was the second objective, about 2 miles from the start line. At this point the cavalry would take over, assisted by the Whippets, and race on to take the third objective, the outer Amiens defense line. 6th Battalion summed up its experiences on the day by saying, in a marginal note in its history, Whippets not suitable for cooperation with cavalry. It went on to point out that either the cavalry wanted to advance at the gallop, leaving the Whippets behind, or the Whippets would move forward in the face of machine gun fire, while the cavalry had to dismount and seek cover. The battalion also pointed out that when the Whippets came to take over the advance, they were obliged to operate over a great frontage and depth, so that even companies became scattered. Before long they were broken down into individual sections and the section became the unit, which was in direct opposition to Colonel Charrington's earlier directive. Because they were so scattered, and the distances were great, the only way senior officers such as company commanders could keep in touch was if they were mounted on horses, which accounted for the high casualty rate amongst them. Conversely, section commanders had to travel in one of their tanks in order to keep up, which made it difficult for them to maintain control. Cavalry also had an unfortunate habit of wandering off along routes such as sunken lanes, which often took them away from the direction of attack. It also seems that they were not aware of the limitations of the tanks. For instance, a composite section of 7 tanks under Captain J. Renwick, after losing 1 tank to artillery fire, was directed over a segment of the Oldham trench system, where most of the trenches were overgrown and in 26 a dilapidated state. All of the surviving 6 tanks became bogged and 3 were subsequently knocked out by artillery fire. Meanwhile, the third composite section, under Captain Chapman, found itself being directed along the Parvillers Road, which, from a reconnaissance on foot, they found to be covered by the German field guns that would have been able to fire at point-blank range at any approaching tanks. There were also a number of occasions when tanks were sent to meet up with a cavalry detachment at a particular point only to find themselves alone. Following one more successful action with the Queen's Bays, 2 tanks finally broke away and went hunting on their own. One of these tanks, commanded by Lieutenant C.B. Arnold, became involved in clearing up an artillery battery in front of the 60th Australian Brigade, and then, having become separated from the other tank, went on a wild spree, shooting up enemy transport and troops at various locations before finally being knocked out and captured. In the aftermath of the first 3 days of Amiens, the Whippet tanks seem to have been used for more general work, mostly in support of infantry. In the main, they used their mobility to attack nests of machine guns that were holding up the infantry. As they did so, there was a notable increase in tank casualties. Tanks were struck by artillery and destroyed by fire, which often included the crew. Although they continued to use crews on alternating days, this still meant that the tanks were being employed on a daily basis, with precious little time to spare for maintenance. As a result, there were increasing instances of tanks breaking down, owing to simple things such as fan drive breaking to more fundamental failures such as the complete collapse of engine components, particularly the big end. Heat continued to be a problem, and not only for the crew. Colonel Charrington, writing in the 3rd Battalion War Diary on the 24th of August 1918, pointed out that 1 hour's running with the door shut could render a tank weaponless except for the crew's revolvers. In the hot interior, machine guns would jam as rounds expanded or even exploded, and often the gun itself became too hot to handle. On any occasion the steering wheel became too hot to touch. 3rd Battalion laterally worked in conjunction with New Zealand, Australian and American forces, but supporting them in the infantry role. Note as cavalry. Although it was noted that on certain occasions a heavy tank, like a Mark V, would have been more suitable, Whippet commanders found that, if used cleverly and taking advantage of their maneuverability, they could outflank and destroy enemy machine gun or artillery batteries. When used individually, the tanks were more vulnerable, and many were destroyed by direct hits, with the crew often lost as well. There was a dramatic incident on the 29th of August, when Lieutenant Cecil Sewell rescued the crew of another tank in his section at the cost of his life, resulting in the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross. Actions continued, with every available spareman given over to tank maintenance and with a dwindling number of serviceable tanks 27 available. On the 20th of September, the entire 3rd Battalion could muster only 31 Whippets fit for action, and, of these, the Tank South Company were allocated to work in conjunction with the Austin Armored Cars of 17th Armored Car Battalion, Tank Corps in an attack on the village of Boney. This failed, partly because on reaching the agreed meeting point the tanks found that the armored cars had gone on ahead, but also because the intensity of enemy fire that they encountered, when they finally followed in the wake of the armored cars, was so great that they had to withdraw. And in subsequent discussions it was agreed to call this interesting Gex-sprint off. The battalion's last attack in the war was against Suresnes on the 8th of October, when the commanding officer reported that in his view it was a task more suited to heavy tanks. The battalion was down to 11 tanks on this occasion. By the end of that month, the battalion was using Mark V tanks for training, and on the 28th of October it finally handed all its Whippets into central workshops and started upon the new training program. There is an interesting account, told differently in the 6th Battalion History and the Tank Corps Book of Honor, concerning Private Bertie Bussey, a Whippet driver who, on the 23rd of August 1918, after the officer and sergeant in his tank had both been wounded, alternately drove his tank and worked the machine guns with the transmission locked in action for about 4 hours until he was discovered and sent back to the rallying point. Private Bussey received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his efforts. 6th Battalion had acquired its own Victoria Cross hero, also posthumously, in the shape of their commanding officer, Acting Lieutenant Colonel RAWEST, who had already earned a DSO Distinguished Service Order and MC Military Cross. West, while riding forward to ascertain the best time to use his Whippets on the 2nd of September 1918, came across the remains of an infantry battalion with most of its officers already dead and about to receive a strong counterattack. West managed to inspire the men by riding his horse in front of them, but was killed in the process, although the attack was defeated. However, this had nothing to do with Whippet tanks. The following day, 6 Whippets were attached to a squadron, Queen's Own Oxfordshire Hussars. This was the last occasion when they would work with cavalry, and it is interesting that when the advancing tanks passed through the villages of Hermes and Dermicourt, they found them free of Germans, yet, when the cavalry advanced, they encountered machine gun fire coming from Dermicourt and lost 3 horses. This suggests that they laid low when the tanks were nearby, but came to life again when a more 28 suitable target approached. For the final few weeks of the war, 6th Battalion, like the 3rd, was gradually reduced to the point where composite companies had to be formed for specific operations. However, for various reasons, but largely lidway to luck, the 3rd Battalion does not appear to have suffered so many casualties. Its final action of the war began on the 5th of November in conjunction with the Scots and Grenadier Guards. It was only partially successful, but resulted in the Germans retreating overnight, and for the next few days what remained of the battalion was engaged in moving to a new location, and working on its surviving tanks until the armistice was announced on the 11th of November. Whippets abroad. With the ending of the war, some Whippet tanks emigrated. Some went to trouble spots where problems had arisen as a result of the war. Others were purchased by countries anxious to avail themselves of the new technology, while a few more were acquired by allies who thought they would make interesting materials, particularly if their armies had seen action alongside British tanks and wanted a tangible reminder of the connection, at least to had been acquired by the Germans, which they proposed to use until they were repossessed. The Japanese obtained 3 or 4 Whippets, along with a Mark IV and some French Renaults, which they intended to evaluate and train with. They do not appear to have lasted very long. The Japanese army fitted its own machine guns that were derived from the French Hotchkiss, and adapted the armored panel in front of the driver so that it hinged upwards. This not only gave him a better view ahead, as far as that was possible, but it also helped to ventilate the fighting compartment, which was badly needed. The British Army took 16 Whippets to Ireland, where initially they formed B Company, 17th Armoured Car Battalion Tank Corps, which had been rushed across to Ireland from Germany at the end of the war. In due course they seem to have been sent far and wide throughout the country along with an interesting mixture of other tanks and armoured cars. For instance, 2 Whippets along with a Mark IV mail tank and 2 Austin armoured cars formed No. 2 Detachment, Tank Corps based at Cork in 1919. While 4 took part in the Victory Parade through Dublin that summer. 6 went with the British military mission of April 1919 to Russia in support of General Denikin, whose Russians, bolstered by Allied help, were attempting to counter the Bolsheviks and their Red Revolution. Once it became obvious that this was going to be a more daunting task, a much larger detachment of tanks including more Whippets arrived in July 1919 and formed the South Russian Tank Detachment, which had the duty of training White Russian tank crews. This seems to have been a thankless task, because morale was low and their revolutionary movement too strong. The men of the South Russian Tank Detachment were subsequently pulled out of the country, the tanks having been handed over to their White Russian crews. These did not last very long either, and the tanks were then captured and formed a substantial part of the rapidly expanding Red Army. They saw some action against the Poles in Thewis, the Japanese in the east, and dissident groups within Russia itself. There is some evidence that at least stone Whippet had been modified to mount a 37mm gun from Renault, much as had been done by the British, and it is said that in Red Army service they were known as Steelers, on account of their Tyler engines. However, it seems that the survivors only lasted until about 1922. The Union of South Africa purchased 1 Whippet, which was named HMLS Union. It was intended as a memorial, although it seems to have been wheeled out during an industrial dispute in the hope that it might avert the agitators. Unfortunately, it broke down and had to be towed home somewhat ignominiously behind a steam lorry. Individual Whippet tanks were also sent to Canada and the United States, in addition to the movable wrecks captured by the Germans at Bray-sur-Somme, which had been too drastically damaged to be worth restoring. 2 more evidently fell into German hands in somewhat better order. Both were put back into working order by the Bayerische Armee Kraftwagen Park 20 BKP-20, which had established a tank repair facility and captured factory premises near Charleroi in occupied Belgium. 1 was delivered to Berlin, while back 20 retained the other for evaluation. A German officer commanding the captured tank force is reported to have said that in his opinion the Whippet waste only British tank worth copying, which may explain the design of the German tanks LKA and LKI. Both were completed too late to be of any materialist during the war, and in a case suffered from the German commitment to engineering perfection, which delayed their completion until it was too late. The other Whippet, the one that went to Berlin, was photographed in Freikorps service during the street fighting against the communist-inspired Spartacist movement in January 1919. Both tanks had to be handed over to British troops in the summer of 1919 when Germany finally surrendered. Nobody would argue that the medium a Whippet needed replacing. The allocation of the crew compartment, the truly appalling conditions inflicted on men, the complicated driving arrangements, poor driver visibility, and the extra time required to keep both engines in trim, thus doubling up maintenance time, were more than enough to condemn it in the eyes of those who had to use it. Walter Wilson's tank design, created in June 1917, was bound to feature his transmission, but, in an effort to reduce the size, he elected to use a shorter, 4-cylinder version of the Ricardo engine rated at 100 horsepower, many of which were manufactured by Browett, Lindley and Co. of Patricroft, Manchester. Wilson opted for a hull design reminiscent of a heavy tank with a rounded nose and much higher entry point, which gave improved cross-country performance. He moved the crew compartment forward so that the driver was placed centrally, right at the front with the fighting compartment above and behind him. This included 5 ball mountings for Hotchkiss machine guns, 2 facing forwards, 1 to the rear, and 1 each side, along with the usual selection of pistol ports and vision slits. A double flap hatch was fitted in the cab roof for the commander to observe through, but no cupola was provided, although a trunnion could be fitted to support an anti-aircraft machine gun. access doors stuck out on each side, looking like small sponsons. Each one of these was also provided with a ball mounting for a Hotchkiss machine gun, although this was subsequently removed. The tall central superstructure meant that it would be impossible to use a conventional landing beam with this tank, so since some form of unditching apparatus was considered essential, the designers reverted to an earlier type, the Buddicom unditching spit, of which a pair was used, attached to a track on either side and flexible and auto-slide by the superstructure as they went around. Since this system never seemed to work properly on earlier tanks, it is not clear how well it might have behaved on these later medium tanks, but since no photographs have yet been found showing them being used on a medium B, this remains a bit of a puzzle. The engine was placed on the center line of the hull directly in the rear of the fighting compartment, since it was important that it was set as far back as possible. Being a typical Ricardo design, it was quite tall, which necessitated a slightly raised engine deck above the level of the top run of the tracks. It was water-cooled with the radiator located in the left side, and petrol delivered to the engine by the autovac system was carried in 3 petrol tanks low down at the very rear of the hull. The exhaust from the engine wassled into a silencer mounted crosswise, and an outlet pipe carried the fumes down to the back of the tank. A device was fitted that injected sulfonic acid into the exhaust to create a smoke screen. Total fuel capacity was 85 gallons and fuel was consumed at a rate of 3/4 miles per gallon, which gave the medium B a range of about 64 miles. Behind the engine was the typical combination of a 4-speed and reverse gearbox, which was described as unreliable in practice, and a bevel box with pinions and gears linked to Wilson epicyclics at their outboard ends for steering. Chains then carried the motion back to the final drive sprockets, which meshed with the tracks. In top gear, the tank could manage just over 6 miles per hour. This was slower by 2 miles per hour than the medium A, but the medium B was 4 tons heavier at 18 tons and of course a lot easier to drive, particularly in terms of steering, which must have made a lot of difference. Conditions for the crew inside were a lot better, since the engine was separated from the fighting compartment by a bulkhead with doors giving access to each side. But Wilson was severely criticized for the cramped conditions within the engine compartment, which meant that anyone trying to work in there with the engine running or just stopped ran the risk of being roasted alive. This could make a crucial difference if a tank were to break down on the battlefield. Orders were placed for some 700 machines with the Metropolitankery Wagon and Finance Company in Birmingham through their subsidiary the Patent Shaft and Axletree Company of Wednesbury, although his order was soon cancelled, and with the North British Locomotive Company and the Coventry Ordnance Works in Glasgow. The prototype, which was completed by September 1918, was built in Birmingham, presumably where Wilson could keep an eye on it. However, the first production tank appeared from the Coventry Ordnance Works. All told, some 100 to medium B tanks were completed, and the number sequences seen in photographs suggest that some of them were built by all 3 contractors. Of these, 45 were taken into service and the remainder scrapped. It is not clear how many were completed by each contractor. A version of the medium D was proposed to mount a 2PDR gun. However, this must have been an entirely new weapon, and not the automatic Vickers pom-pom. References claim that design work on the 2PDR held up production of the 6PDR gun fitted in male heavy tanks, but where this new weapon might have been mounted in a male medium B is not recorded. In any case, the project was abandoned in March 1918. The post-war career of this all but forgotten tank is not well recorded. An unspecified number were shipped to Dublin to join C Company, 17th Battalion Tank Corps, which was based there, but little is known about them, and number 36 photographs have come to light, suggesting that there were not many of them and they were rarely used. 3 medium BS were shipped out to Archangel to join the North British Tank Detachment, which was stationed there to protect the port and vast stocks of British supplies from falling into the hands of the Bolsheviks. Of these 3, 1 tank and a Mark V heavy model were passed on to White Russian forces, who reputedly used them quite effectively. However, when the Bolsheviks closed in, they refused to surrender them and reportedly sunk the tanks in the Dvina River. The other 2 were handed over to the Latvian army when the British pulled out in October 1919, and one of these was still in Latvian service in 1926. However, photographic evidence suggests that one medium B fell into Bolshevik hands and was put back into working order in Moscow. Its ultimate fate is not known. In Britain, at least one medium B was issued to the Royal Engineers Experimental Bridging Establishment at Christchurch, where it was used to tow new bridges. This tank, or a similar one, was seen on the 23rd of January 1941 at Christchurch, stripped of most of its internal fittings as part of the test load for a Mark III English bridge. But this was wartime and it did not survive. A few medium B tanks must have remained at locations such as Bovington, but none ever seemed to have entered battalion service apart from those in Ireland. In due course they were presumably all scrapped except for one, earmarked for the original tank museum collection, which ultimately also went for scrap. Perhaps this is a comment on its perceived significance. Medium C. The Hornet of one ignores Foster's propaganda and accepts official information. Then the sign of the Medium C commenced in March 1918. About 9 months after the Medium B and only a month after the first production example of Wilson's tank had been delivered. This raises a number of questions. Assuming this was before faults with the Medium B became obvious, why did the designers bother with a new model? And why in any case did not Triton and Wilson cooperate on the design following the success of their earlier partnership? There is no evidence to suggest that they had fallen out. On the other hand, it was clear that Triton's earlier design, the Medium A, was not entirely satisfactory, and Wilson, as the inventor of the epicyclic 37 steering system, probably thought that he could do better. Maybe the authorities felt they should have two strings to their bow, namely the inventive genius of Wilson and Triton, the experienced engineer with excellent manufacturing facilities at his back. We will probably never know for sure. Both tanks were similar in design, although the Medium C was the larger. Indeed, it was longer and taller by a few inches than the old heavy tank of 1916, but not as wide since it did not carry sponsons. One feature that Triton made much of was the fact that the crew compartment was a much healthier place. In fact, it was not much warmer than the ambient temperature outside. This may also have been true off the Medium B, but since Triton made more of it, the suggestion is that he was well aware of the problems with the Medium A and wanted to advertise the fact that he had overcome them. The crew of the Medium C came to for a commander, driver, and 2 gunners, as in the Medium B. However, the gunners would have been kept busy in action. There were 2 Oshkosh machine gun mountings in the front of the superstructure, above the driver's head, one on each side of the superstructure and one more at the back, along with one that could be fitted to a trunnion mounting in the roof hatch for anti-aircraft use when required. There was also a pistol port at the very back of the tank, alongside a small escape door. The gunner would have had to make his way down a narrow corridor at the side of the engine to reach it, and was then cut off entirely from the rest of the crew. The commander, on the other hand, was provided with a rotating cupola, or lookout turret as it was called then, high up on the roof of the superstructure. That gave him an uninterrupted view all around the tank. The only drawback was that this had to be removed for rail travel, since it exceeded the railway loading gauge. Once again, the central superstructure of the Medium C meant that a conventional ditching beam could not be used, and reports suggest that individual torpedo spuds were provided instead. However, the same problem would have applied as indicated for the Medium B, and there is no hard evidence to show whether they were used or not. As it was over 3 feet longer than the Medium B, it proved possible to equip Medium C with the full 6-cylinder Ricardo engine. However, now that wartime restrictions on the use of alloys were coming to an end, it was possible to use more aluminum in the construction of the engine, so that it was appreciably lighter than the version adopted for the Mark V. Although it still delivered the full 150 horsepower. The engine was installed facing backward so that it drove forwards through the clutch to a Wrigley 4-speed gearbox, via bevel box to cross shafts that engaged with epicyclic steering gears in the frames, and then through to successive loops of chain and intermediate 39 sprockets to the final drive track sprockets at the back. The 4-speed gearbox was identified as the component most likely to give a trouble. Above the gearbox was the radiator, set longitudinally and cooled by a pair of Foppist fans on a drive shaft. One very typical Triton touch first seen on the Whippet was a central cluster of 7 track rollers on each side covering the main weight bearing point on the frames that were fitted with roller bearings and contributed to the Medium C tank's excellent top speed for its day off. nearly 8 miles per hour. Even so, the new medium was not quite so well armored as Wilson's design, since maximum armor thickness was just 12 millimeters covering vital parts compared with 14 millimeters on the medium B. As with the medium B, it was proposed to arm some if not all of the tanks with a new 2PDR weapon, although whether this would have made it a male tank is not entirely clear. This term was never used with the medium tanks, so it may have been considered as a means of enhancing the firepower of all tanks. In the event, as we have seen, production of the 2PDR was halted because it compromised the 6PDR program. However, there were proposals to create what was in effect a male version of the medium C, referred to by the surprisingly modern term of tank destroyer. No example was ever built that we know of, although drawings survive in the illustrated parts lists, so we have a pretty good idea of what it might have looked like. The superstructure was raised above the crew compartment, and a complete mounting for a 6PDR gun provided in such a way that the weapon extended forwards above the driver's head. The original scheme seems to have been to use the 23 caliber weapon as fitted to marks for NV Tanks 1, but upon consideration it was felt that muzzle blast from this could affect the driver. So the plan was altered in favor of the old 40 caliber gun as fitted to male versions of the Mark I tank of 1916-2, which moved muzzle a further 38 inches 96.9 centimeters away from the driver's position and presumably spared him from the effects of the blast. Since the 40 caliber gun had a marginally better 40 performance than the later version in terms of range and muzzle velocity, this might have improved its performance against other tanks. But since it was never built or used in action, this is only academic speculation. The drawings of the superstructure of the 6PDR also show extensions bulging out over the tracks at each side, and it seems as if the side mountings for the Hotchkiss machine guns were moved here and set facing forwards. For medium C tanks represented the tank corps at the London Victory Parade of July 1919. None ever went abroad, but a few were used at home in support of the civil powers at times of industrial unrest, such as the Liverpool police strike or the potential riots in Glasgow. Experience soon showed that armored cars were far more suitable for this work, being more mobile and less threatening, but such was the reputation of tanks at this time they were chosen instead. 24 medium C tanks formed A and B companies of 2nd Battalion Tank Corps, 12 tanks per company, which moved from Bovington to Farnborough in 1921 and became a common sight on the roads around that part of Surrey. They took part in a number of southern command exercises until replaced by more modern medium tanks from about 1923. No medium C survived to be preserved, but some 6 tanks were still around in 1930. They were taken out of store and sent to the Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment MWE at Farnborough for potential use as tank recovery vehicles. Nothing survives to show what modifications might have been involved. In any case, the project was abandoned, and with that the medium C disappears from history. Medium Major Philip Johnson, who commanded No. 3 advanced workshops in France, was a gifted and inventive engineer who before Thur had worked for Fowlers of Leeds in their Bombay office. Johnson's inventive genius was such that No. 3 advanced workshops was dedicated entirely to experimental work that they continued to do under Johnson's instructions when he was transferred to Tank Corps headquarters in France. Johnson was dedicated to making tanks go faster, and he realized that, in order to do this, tanks required springs. His first attempt to do this involved a Mark IV, although no details of this and no photograph have yet been found. Johnson then conducted a more radical experiment on a medium A, which did achieve impressive results. He did, however, also appreciate that providing springs for every wheel station increased the weight, and in an effort to overcome this developed a novel arrangement whereby a system of flexible steel wire rope was employed as the main suspension system, running over and under pulleys and connected to a spring at the end. Thus, as each wheel rose over an obstacle, it forced up the cable, which pulled on the spring. Once the tank was on a flat surface again, the spring and cable forced the suspension to level out. Johnson also came up with the idea of threading the track shoes onto a loop of wire rope that ran around the suspension. This caused that track to bend around the curve as the tank steered, reducing the side thrust in a conventional machine and making steering easier. These ideas were first tried on a modified Mark V heavy tank, and then applied to a new tank of Johnson's own design. This was the Medium D. It was such a revolutionary thing that an officer from Tank Corps HQ in France, Major Giffard Martel, came over to Britain to inspect the full-size wooden mock-up. Even when it first appeared, it seems obvious that nobody was ever likely to mistake the new tank for anything else. It was very distinctive. The crew compartment at the front was essentially oval in plan form with mountings for 3 Hotchkiss machine guns, one at the front and one each side. Above and behind them sat the driver, for whom a cupola was provided. Although there was no similar facility for a commander unless this duty devolved upon the driver, however. As Johnson was at pains to point out to his critics, the tank was really no more than a mechanical testbed and other matters could be attended to once these basic problems had been solved. Another curious feature that an observer would note is that the rear drive sprocket was set rather higher than the idler. This was a typical Johnson feature and said to bearings so that the tank could tackle a difficult obstacle in reverse. The medium D was powered by a 240 horsepower Siddeley Puma aircraft engine, a water-cooled straight 6. The transmission, on which Walter Wilson was consulted, involved 3-speed epicyclics on each output shaft that provided gear-changing and graduated steering facilities. These controls are all said to have been hydraulic. Every effort was made to keep the weight down in the interests of speed and because, in line with Johnson's creed, the tank was intended to be amphibious. Armor was therefore limited to 10 mm around the crew and 6 mm elsewhere, resulting in an all-up weight of 13.5 tons. Tests conducted by the Admiralty at Johnson's request suggested that the long, narrow tank would be unstable in the water. All told, 10 prototypes were ordered, 4 from Fowler's of Leeds to Off which were never completed, and 6 from Vickers through their Wolseley subsidiary in Birmingham. Of these, 1 was apparently destroyed by fire at Christchurch, 2 were sent out for trials in India, and 2 more were completed as improved models. The fate of the others is not recorded. The medium D asterisk looked very similar to the medium D, although in fact it was wider, at 8 feet 5 inches instead of 7 feet 3 inches, to improve stability in the water. However, it was still not good enough to satisfy the Admiralty. It is also reported to have had 4-speed epicyclics in the transmission, all of which increased the weight by 1 ton. Its service career is not recorded, although it ended its days in the open-air tank museum at Bovington. To some extent the medium D ** could be regarded as a completely new tank, although it was assembled from parts intended for a cancelled medium. To begin with, it had been widened to 9 feet, which at last ensured that it was stable in the water, and was nearly 2 feet longer. It was powered by a high-compression version of the Siddeley Puma, which delivered 300 horsepower, and the transmission involved a primary 4-speed and reverse gearbox with experimental Rackham clutches on the output shafts for steering. Weight had no increase to 15 tons. In 1921 it was sent for conversion, and when it emerged again it was equipped with a 370 horsepower Rolls-Royce engine and a Williams-Janney hydraulic steering system and final drive, which had already failed in other tank trials. It does not appear to have done any better 46 this time, being recorded as ceasing running in August 1922 and as being broken up about 3 years later. The final manifestation of the medium D appeared in the form of medium D modified or medium DM, 2 of which were delivered by the Ordnance Factory at Woolwich in August 1921. Johnson by this time had been appointed head of the Department of Tank Design and Experiment, located at Charlton Park near Woolwich. Both tanks were powered by a 260 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagle V12. Although it is claimed that each tank had a different transmission for trial purposes, neither type is specified. One feature that Johnson may have introduced to satisfy his critics was a second cupola, presumably for the tank commander, situated alongside that provided for the driver. The medium DM was also amphibious, although any of them sank in the River Thames and had to be fished out. Both tanks were sent to the new tank testing section at Farnborough in August 1921, where they are recorded as ceased running a year later and subsequently broken up. Although this ended the medium tank saga, it should be noted that Johnson persisted in designing and building prototypes for a year or so in the face of increasing financial stringency before his departure. It was closed down, and the project dropped. The medium D was visualized by the Tank Corps' tactical eminence J.F.C. Fuller as the epitome of his war-winning Plan 1919, and he clung to this despite mounting evidence of its unreliability. Indeed, at one point while in the War Office, Fuller records that in pursuit of the ideal tank for Plan 1919, he was torn between increasing the supply of medium C tanks or investing the available funds in the unproven potential of the medium D. He decided in favor of the latter, and was spared embarrassment only by